Okey-doke. Hi there. You are the brave ones for coming to this session. You are the brave ones, but and we're really looking forward to it. This is going to be really worth your time. So, look, thanks for coming to a session that we've actually just called Meeting Shrooms. All right? So we're going to break that down about why that's exciting and why we're really glad that you're here. Just to set the scene, my name's Al Turner. I'm Managing Director of 8PR and Marketing, but outside of that, I write the Global Trends Report for IBTM, which is being realized here in this stage over the 3 days of IBTM. One of the big sections in it is around trends and sustainability. And what we wanted to do, because Accelerate is a little bit more than just talking about the problems and single-use plastics and things like that, is to start looking at big solutions. And Dr. Vincent Walsh is someone who lives in big solutions to big, big problems. And I'm really, really excited about having Dr. Vincent here today for you. I'm going to ask him loads of questions. You should too. So do use the Slido app. We got loads of great questions in the last session. Please ask questions. We'll get going so you get a bit of an idea what Vinny's about, what he's doing, and hopefully that will give you some ideas of where this session's going to go and where the value will be. So Vinny, first of all, mate, thanks for joining us, man. It's really good to see you.
And you.
Can you just, why don't we start? What do you do and who are you?
So for 10 years, I've been working as an academic, looking at biological infrastructure for food. But more important than kind of my academic work is the stuff that I actually do on the ground. So working in Africa, Ethiopia, Spain, Croatia, the UK, basically supporting water companies, food companies, farmers to transfer and start to develop more sustainable, ecological, biological infrastructure on their farms. What does that mean? Well, we all know what regenerative agriculture is about. We all know over the last 150 years, we've completely changed our food industry to something which is a very unintelligent. It doesn't work. And we've got 3.8 billion years of knowledge of how the biosphere has evolved. And very recently, we've moved away from that. And we're in a situation now with climate change, biodiversity loss, desertification, et cetera, we have to completely rethink. I mean, like every part of the food industry has to change. And part of that is working on farms. Because if you do it right at the beginning of your supply chain, you can have more innovation right through your supply chain. So part of my work is to look and support farmers, food companies, water companies, to start that development, actually do it on the ground, taking large pieces of land over and start developing more sustainable infrastructure. The other part is circular infrastructure for food companies. When I talk about circular infrastructure, I'm not talking about recycling. Recycling is downcycling. Nature has never done that until we arrive. Nature always upcycles. And our food industry, and industry as a whole, are mostly downcycle. So I'll give you an example of downcycling in, let's say, automotive industry. You take plastic from a car. Plastic from a car, after its use, would then go into a bench. That bench, after use, would go into a toothbrush. That toothbrush would then turn into a toothpick. And that toothpick inevitably ends up in landfill. So every time you go through you're reducing the value of the product, and it inevitably lands in landfill because you can't do anything else with it because it's not biological. So that's a huge area of interest for the food company. Why? Because of waste. If you can turn waste products and upcycle waste products into new products, for example, taking mushrooms or taking waste coffee, turning waste coffee into mushrooms, that's upcycling. Because you're taking a product that you've already used, it's got less value, and then you upcycle it through a biological process to create mushrooms, organic oyster, shiitake, etc. High value mushrooms, and then you put them back into the supply chain. Or you can take waste bread through a biological process, turn it into beer, for example. So with all the companies that I work with globally, that's the area of interest and my expertise. looking at supply chains right at the beginning, looking at regenerative agriculture, forest gardening, agroforestry, etc., and then circular infrastructure, looking at waste streams and turning them waste streams back into food products.
Fantastic. Well, it's very similar. Let's go back over that, right? So first of all, why does a farm need to be redesigned?
Well, firstly, design is really important. You know, farmers are not designers. They're not guys who build biological, ecological systems, you know, and that's what we need right now, especially in the UK, but also globally. You see in places like Yorkshire, in the UK, you know, all our farmland is now mostly silver pasture with sheep or cows on it, hardly any trees, not so much good soil, not putting carbon in the soil, not doing water management, not raising biodiversity. You know, them days are over. Literally over. You know, we cannot continue to develop infrastructure which is unintelligent, which goes completely against the 3.8 billion years of knowledge, of ecological knowledge, of understanding how the biosphere works. All the expertise is there. All we need to do is look at nature and mimic it.
Fantastic. Let's bring this a little bit more relevant into this room. Tell us when you started working with the meetings industry or the meetings and events industry and kind of what triggered your interest in what we do.
Yeah. Well, first I was working for a large global food company who has a subsidiary company, Line Portfolio, you know, and I was working for that company on their future food. And I thought it was just quite interesting, you know, an events company developing a report of what future food looks like. And why were they doing that? Because they understand a huge part of the event industry is food and beverage. I think they did a report, you know, and it was, I can't remember, but it was kind of, I think it was the top 2 things that people want to know and why would go to a particular event. The food and beverage in the event is actually really important. You know, so the event sector globally has got a huge responsibility, you know, to make sure that you're building proper infrastructure so you can get sustainable ecological food into the events, firstly. The second part is when this is all done and all us go home, you know, where's all the waste and how is that waste being treated? You know, I think it's easy for food companies to kind of start putting that infrastructure in because they are food companies. But I think the event sector, a huge part of what you do is around food. And that's what really interested me, you know, of supporting an events company to kind of rethink, you know, how can they make sure they have the most sustainable, resilient, ecological food on their menus every time they do every time they do an event.
And outside of the company that you're working with, which is doing some great work thanks to yourself, how would you critique the rest of the industry, or let's be honest, the majority of the events industry in terms of how it looks after its food, how it sources it, how it gets rid of it at the end of the day? Globally, how are we doing?
Yeah, well, I think pretty poor, you know, from what I'm seeing. But therefore, there's the opportunity. And I think, you know, most food companies and land-based companies right now are all kind of in that transition, you know, especially with the large companies and the large event companies. You know, there's a huge, if you're thinking about completely rethinking how you do your events and the food into that event, you know, it's kind of rethinking the whole offer, you know. And I think, you know, there's a huge challenge there for companies to invest in that, especially around the events. I think larger food companies, they're doing a lot, but we still need to do much more. You know, we've got 10, 15 years, you know, to kind of rethink, you know, the food sector and to make sure everything we grow is more sustainable, it's more local, it's grown in an ecological manner, and also the waste that's coming out is all circular.
Fantastic. I just want to land this a little bit more as well. I mean, clearly we're looking at big food issues, we're looking at big infrastructural issues. But I want to land it in something quite simply, which is why we call this meeting shrooms, obviously a pun. Just talk to me about your conversations with Chef Buckley around mushrooms and how that is having, or is going to have, a fundamental effect on their business in terms of its waste and its CO2 targets as well. Can you just tell us that circular story tell us about mushrooms, basically,
yeah,
and why they're awesome?
Well, firstly, you know, mushrooms, we're more connected to mushrooms than we are to plants. They're way older in the biosphere, you know. So, we are more mushrooms than we are plants. And we have a deep connection to mushrooms because without mushrooms, there'll be no forests, because everything that connects the forest is mushrooms, How trees speak to each other is through mushrooms. So if you, at one end of a farm, if you've got something like an autumn olive, well, an autumn olive is a great plant to take up, to put nitrogen, fixed nitrogen into the ground. It's a system plant. Even though it's an edible, and a great shrub, a great windbreak, but it is also a natural fixing plant. And then right at the other end, you have something like an apple. That doesn't fix nitrogen, and it also can't take up potassium because it hasn't got deep tapping roots. Well, fungi knows that, and it'll connect with the nearest trees, to take that resource and enable the whole system, to have a really good equilibrium. The idea of Darwinism, and competition, that doesn't happen in a forest system. It's kind of that's more around natural selection of how a species evolves. But how forest evolves is not about survival of the fittest. Far from it. Forests evolve through cooperation and evolving together. So that's why mushrooms are critical for us, because without mushrooms, forests can't do what they do, and without forests, there is no us.
They're also the teeth, aren't they? I remember you talking to me about they're the teeth of the forest.
Yeah, again, circular infrastructure. Where do you think we get it from? Regenerative and circular infrastructure by mimicking natural systems. So in a forest system, think about it. A forest system is energetically open to the sun, and it's materially closed. So it gets its energy for the sun, and then it takes in that energy and it puts it into the soil to build complex soil structures, and fungi is a key part of that, because as you go through the seasons, and as all the tree matter falls on the floor, where is it going? Where does it go? Fungi eats it. That's what fungi does. It lives off wood, then it grows its mushroom, and then that's its life cycle. So circular, when we're thinking about circular infrastructure, all we're doing is trying to mimic woodlands and forests, and try use that kind of thinking in a business, trying to think of businesses not as an input and an output, but as a proper ecosystem, and that's where, why fungi is so important to the food industry.
What we then found, I'll let you tell the story, but then we found out that, we don't find out that, but the company that Vinny works with produces lots of coffee, as does many of the venues and events and things like that. So what we're now using is that fungi to do something to the coffee, which you can explain.
Yeah. So
and methane.
Yeah. So this isn't new stuff. What we're doing here, but we're taking basically we take waste coffee, and then we're looking at developing an innovation lab that we can take the waste coffee, we can then inject oyster mushrooms into it. And over time, and in a certain environment, what we do is, firstly, we create an environment which is a warm woodland environment. So the fungi, as we inject the coffee into the fungi in these large tubes, so we put all the waste coffee into these large tubes, hanging from the roof, and then inject it in different areas. And then over time, about 2 weeks, the fungi will start eating the waste coffee. And then what we do is we mimic the life cycle, and we drop the temperature in the room. And what then the mushroom thinks that the tree has kind of fallen over, or it's at the right time in the season, to grow the actual mushroom. So all we're trying to mimic is that process. So we put the coffee into the bags, we inject oyster mushrooms, or mostly oyster we do, and then we'll drop the temperature 2 weeks later, and about a month later, you start getting mushrooms out of it. And it's a really good way of taking a waste product out of landfill. Why would you put coffee in landfill? It's a really horrible thing to put into landfill. It excretes about 20 times more methane than it does carbon dioxide in landfill. It's a horrible thing to put in landfill. And loads of it's going into landfill, and there's absolutely no reason for it. And event companies, actually, large ones like this, where you're probably drinking a lot of coffee and there's a lot of waste coffee, there is because it's centralised, there is potential with these kind of large venues to look at that, and potentially getting output from the business on the coffee that you're drinking for the event or for the next event for food or whatever it is.
So the next step in our mushroom story is we suddenly are producing lots and lots of mushrooms because we're getting rid of the coffee. So talk to us about Chef Buckley, the 50/50 burger, and sorry, I'll let you do it. Go on. Where do our mushrooms go next?
So I own a food company called Herblabism. We've been set up a couple of years now, and the main thing is to create a whole range of products out of mushrooms and only mushrooms. So using no corn or mycoprotein, no soya, no palm oil, all them, high processed vegan foods that we're seeing on the street, on the market at the moment. I think they're horrible. I think the processed horrible. It's virtually monoculture, but plant-based. And I think, if we're eating plant-based food, we need something which is more localized, more sustainable, stuff that we really want to eat. And I think mushrooms play into that a lot. So we created a mushroom burger, a herb burger, a chorizo sausage, and a veggie and mushroom sausage. And then one of the chefs that I've been working with then created a 50/50 burger. So this company, I can't say the name, but in 2018, they bought, I think it was 18 million pounds of burgers. That's what they bought for their supply chain. It's a huge supply chain, So, and they're trying to cut down on their meat. So how do you go about that? Well, mushroom is a good way to do it. Why? Because oysters and shiitake are actually quite fleshy. That you can do a lot with them. So they changed that supply chain. To instead of just mince, now it's a 50/50 burger. You can't taste the difference. It's a really amazing product, but they reduce. In just one product, they've basically half the mince, and for them it's a huge footfall, and win, and because the carbon committed to that global infrastructure is huge. So just by rethinking some of the ingredients within the foods that they already serve and using it more local, more sustainable products, which they can control, and invest into their own infrastructure. This is another thing that's happening with the food industry. You're finding food industries now going into farming because they want to vertically integrate. Because the more innovation you have right in the supply chain, the more innovation you can have all the way through.
That's brilliant. And what we found out, and I don't know whether it was one of your plans on this one, but we started to, reduce the amount of freight bringing meat around the world. We started reducing the amount of packaging because the mushrooms are being produced locally in farms, so packaging and plastics went down and things like that. And suddenly you're just creating all these other sustainable effects just by focusing on small things, big things in a thought-through way.
Yeah, exactly. Because when you start, there's so much the circular infrastructure of that. When you start developing it's virtually never-ending. For example, you're building forest systems with mushrooms, and you're using oyster mushrooms, and you can take waste coffee and turn that waste coffee into mushrooms. So you end up, by going through that biological process, you end up with two things. You end up with mushrooms, but you end up with also loads of biomass, spores. Well, what are the best decomposer of wood matter in forest systems? Oyster mushrooms. So as you start building that circular infrastructure, what we're starting to see is there's loads of interesting outputs coming out of that, not just in terms of mushrooms or new food products, but also infrastructure. For example, waste spores from the mushroom production, which can be fed then back into your farmland, and that's exactly what we're doing. In our farmland, can I speak a little bit?
Please, please.
In the UK and mostly globally, forest systems are all based on layers. In the UK, about 7 layers. So that's our soil layers, our ground covers, our shrubs, our dwarf fruiting trees, our larger fruiting trees, our canopy trees. They're the layers that what make a woodland. And what we do is we mimic them layers to everyone being food production layer. So we're mimicking the structures and the layers of forest systems, and we're doing this, a large scale. So, and we put that infrastructure in it on the farm. The reason we do that is because by looking at how young woodlands evolve, we realise that they become permanent. And that's what we mean. We need a permanent agriculture, not an agriculture which is unintelligent, highly pesticide, and not putting any carbon in, not adding biodiversity. We just cannot farm like that anymore. So the complete opposite to that is to look at what nature's been doing for a long time, mimic them structures or stratas, and each one of them layers turn into a food-producing layer. For example, one of them layers is a fruit tree layer. In the UK, we have 2,600 different apples. 2,600. How many do we eat? We probably eat 10 of them, if that. Why? Because of globalized agriculture. Because Tesco's and the big supermarkets tell you what to eat because they choose the food that fits their supply chain. That has to change, and there's especially for the UK coming out of Brexit, we're highly reliant on Europeans for food and globalized food, and we need to completely change that and take our sovereignty back, our food back, and develop the kind of ecosystems that we need in the UK to hit our net zero targets, to raise the biodiversity, but also, more importantly, to deliver really sustainable, healthy foods.
Fantastic. Is everyone keeping up? Because I've got to say, I've spoken to Vinny many a times, and I struggle to keep up at the best of times as well. So well done, by the way, for doing it. I'm going to jump to some quite cool questions, actually, which I really, really like. So go on in. Should a large venue like this have its own farm?
Yes, well, I think for the farm, for the event company, I think they should be trying to work with local farmers, in and around Barcelona, And when I'm talking about farms, talking about about grass farms, but also vertical farms, more hyper-localized infrastructure. You have to understand that the stuff you get out of woodlands are perennials. Yeah, the perennial foods, and the UK in particular, we hardly grow any perennials anymore because we're so reliant on European annuals, and we have to kind of take some of that back. So yes, Barcelona, big events companies like this should be investing, with smaller food companies to get them in here. But also, I think the outputs of this event, all your waste cups, waste coffee, all that that also should be going to local farms and so on. So I think it's about trying to connect, maybe not developing your own farm infrastructure, or maybe having a vertical farm inside or something like that.
Fantastic. I like that a lot. And that does touch on the other questions. How would you design a food chain for this event, which I think you sort of touched on. I want to sort of conclude, spend the last sort of 5 minutes talking about ambition, because all over this theatre and throughout the knowledge program, we've been talking about sustainability and our importance as the events to be more sustainable and have ambitions. But you've got an opinion on ambition, because what we're talking about here is big solutions, brave solutions. It's sometimes quite untangible to an event organizer who's just trying to do an event, or a venue that just needs to get through and budgets are tight and things like that. What's your advice, your standpoint on trying to change things?
Yeah, well, I think knowledge is overrated and imagination in everything, I just think, we know what we need to know when it comes to sustainability, how to build ecosystems, closed ecological life support systems, etc. We know how to do it. All we need now is loads of imagination, to take over as much farmland as possible, working with farmers. Farmers that had, especially in the UK, they've had a kind of a nightmare over the last 10, 15 years. They're about to lose all their subsidiaries as well in the next couple of years. So I'm working with some farmers in Yorkshire, and they've virtually been left with nothing, and they really need new solutions of how to create a farm which is economically viable, and completely going away from silver pasture and silver arable, which is not design based. We need more design in our farming infrastructure, and we know how to do it. We just need lots of imagination, lots of people getting involved, and taking over huge amounts of farmland. I've never had a conversation with a farmer where you're telling them or supporting them to think differently, and they're negative about it. Yes, they don't understand tree infrastructure because, what we're doing is, it's more about tree infrastructure. And a lot of farmers have never had lots of trees on the farm, hedgerows, windbreaks, etc. But they've never thought of it as an economically viable way of developing a farm. And that's kind of, what one of the challenges. But like I say, it's just we need to take huge amounts of farmland over globally, and put your wellies on and get involved and make the transition.
Fantastic. And then just lastly, because a lot of this is about incentives, right? How can the meetings and events industry pressure its venues, its destinations, its buyers, or anything like that to have this sort of conversation, which isn't just let's source our water properly and let's make sure our single-use plastic is cut down and let's not do it, but actually to turn around and say, where are you getting your food? How are you getting your food? Do you know, how would you encourage us to have those conversations?
Well, I think, it's all about, public perception. I guess, your events company, if you're spending a load of money on, in bringing in, investing in an event like this, and you have food, and we know that food is really important part of it. Don't you want the best food? Shouldn't you really be kind of trying to push that, particularly now? And I think so. I think doing it all for the right reasons and no other reason. If you're going to have food on your event, it should be sustainable. It should be ecological. It should be as localized as possible. It's not rocket science. It's pretty basic. And by doing that, you support the little guys on. The people who are trying to, because what you find is mostly, the innovation is happening with the smaller companies, not the large companies, and the ones that I work with, to support an event like this, they would jump at it. So I think be local, be more, less centralized, and think about how your business can support other, food entrepreneurs and so on.
Bro, we've got a couple of minutes left. Has anyone got any questions that they haven't put, who don't like the Slido app or would like to raise their hands? Has anyone got any points they want to make or questions for Vinny before I give you back to the show? What about that? We'll go. Claire, do we have a mic? No, oh, there you go. Here we go. Don't worry, Claire, we've got a mic.
I'll put my mask back on and behave myself. I was just going to ask, how can people get in touch if they want you to help with their events?
Oh, yeah. So I'm mostly on LinkedIn. So Dr. Vincent Walsh on LinkedIn. That's my main network. I don't really do Twitter that much or Facebook or anything like that. Also got a couple of websites, drvincentwalsh.com. Regen Ag Farm and Herblabism, my food company. So yeah, any of them. But mostly on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Brill. Well, look, I hope that's proved interesting and informative. Certainly, I'm constantly fascinated by what Vinny's got to say. It's a box of tricks that just keeps on giving. I hope also that what we try to do here is just show that there's things that we can do on a micro level, but there's things that we have massive effects on a macro level as procurers of large things and dealers of large people. And I think we've got a voice, and perhaps we don't use it enough. And people like Vinny can help us articulate our power to do good things. So if in doubt, enjoy mushrooms and meeting shrooms a little bit more. And if you would, maybe give Vinny a round of applause for his time and energy.
Thank you.
Bro, have a lovely day. Enjoy soon.